The very first parish that I served as rector shortly after my ordination was a small congregation in southern Maryland in the town of La Plata, Maryland. And I loved that parish, I still do. And I love that community, and I have a deep affection and affinity for the church building as well. When I was rector in La Plata, the town itself and the church community were in a state of rapid transition and change. You see, for the first 100 years of its existence, La Plata was largely a relatively tight-knit, small, some would say sleepy community in southern Maryland. But the decade before I arrived had witnessed great changes in the community. You see, in the early 2000s, La Plata was actually devastated by an F4 tornado that swept through the town and left a huge swath of destruction in its place. In fact, Christ Church, my church there in La Plata, was one of the few buildings that was left standing intact. And in those years as the town rebuilt, it was also dealing with rapid change in the community as it transitioned from being a sleepy, tight-knit, close community to being a bedroom community primarily composed of commuters who were commuting back and forth to Washington, D.C. And so Christ Church was a church that was not only dealing with its own financial struggles and struggles with its maintaining its historic building, but it was also learning to adapt to the changing times in which it existed. And during my time there, I would frequently go into church early on weekday mornings before anyone else would arrive. And I would go in and just sit in the sanctuary, the nave of the church, in order just to pray and be still in God's presence. Now, Christ Church, as I mentioned, is quite an old church. In fact, the congregation first began worshiping in 1680. That gives you a sense of how old this congregation was. And the building itself was built, the current building was built in the 1870s, and it's still, by Christ Church standards, it's still referred to by the parishioners as the new building. And it was originally built in about 6 miles away. It was built in this village called Port Tobacco. Port Tobacco was originally the county seat for Charles County, Maryland. But around 1900, the railroads came through, and there was a railroad depot built in La Plata. And so the county seat was moved from Port Tobacco to La Plata. And so the congregation realized that they needed to move as well from Port Tobacco to La Plata, but their church that they loved was only 30 years old, and they couldn't bear the thought of leaving it. So they disassembled it stone by stone and moved it up on wagons and rebuilt it in the new county seat right next to the courthouse. And in this church, and it's a beautiful little English Gothic church, and in the church there are stunning stained glass windows, very similar to the windows that we have here at Advent that we brought from the old church on Broad Street. And these windows depict various scenes from the life and ministry of Jesus. Some of the windows have images of Christian symbols, images of the Eucharist, images of baptism. But there's this one window that is kind of right here to your left. It's sort of the first window to your left if you're standing at the altar. And it's very different from the other windows in the church. It actually seems on first glance to be a rather plain stained glass window. It has images of Easter lilies along the side and the bottom. And it has like a crown, like a royal crown at the top of the window. But there's really nothing in the middle between the lilies and the crown. It just seems like it's missing something. Well, this window was designed in such a way that if you're in the church at the right moment, when the sun is hitting the window in just the right angle, a cross appears, and it shines across the front of the church. And I did not know this until one morning. I was in the church praying, as was my custom, and I was sitting in the front pew, And as I opened my eyes, the light was striking the window at just the right angle that this cross just appeared on the front floor of the church. And it only remained there for a few minutes because as the sun continued to rise and the angle of the sun changed, the cross just disappeared as quickly as it appeared. It was this amazing little gift or sign from God of God's continued presence with our community, even in the midst of all the change that we were dealing with. This simple cross appearing and disappearing. And it wasn't something that you could plan on because its appearance really depended on the time of year, the angle of the sun, and whether or not there were clouds in the sky. So you really couldn't count on this little cross appearing. But when it did, it was kind of magical. But just as quickly as it would appear, it would also just recede. It wasn't a moment that you could really hang on to. It was out of our control. I think about that window and that cross when I read this story of Jesus' transfiguration, this really profound moment in the life and ministry of Jesus where he goes up onto the top of this big hill or mountain with three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. And they go up to pray, which was Jesus' usual custom. Jesus frequently would withdraw to a mountain or to a high place in order to escape the crowds to spend time in prayer. And so he invited Peter, James, and John with him. And when he goes up there, something profound happens. We really don't know exactly what happened, but it was something profound, so profound, that the gospel writers tried their best to describe whatever it was that happened. The gospel writers state that Jesus' appearance changed. It had changed in such a way that the only way the gospel writers could describe it is that he appeared bright, as if bathed by light. And Peter, James, and John not only see Jesus' appearance changed, but they also had this vision of Elijah and Moses standing there with Jesus. And Peter, God love him, Peter is so overwhelmed in this moment as any of us would be. Peter wants to hold on to sort of the magic of this moment. And so he says to Jesus, "It is good that we are here. Let us build a booth or a dwelling place for you and for Moses and Elijah." And it seems that as quickly as he says this, the whole thing is over. As much as Peter wants to hold on to this moment and to grasp it and to remain in this moment, the moment seems to pass. I love this story of the Transfiguration because it says a lot to us about our own faith lives as well. You see, as we go through life, we will periodically have these moments of intimacy with God. These moments of profound peace, or these moments in which everything, at least in that moment, seems okay. Or those moments where even when our lives are falling apart, we have that weird sense of assurance that it's okay, God is with us. We have these moments of profound intimacy with God. And oftentimes they come when we least expect them, and we can't make them happen. As much as we would like to, we can't make these moments happen. All we can do is sort of show up and be open to them. But God acts as God does, and we can't control God. And when these moments happen, we want to dwell in them and to remain in them. When we have those moments of profound peace and intimacy with God, it's a natural desire for us to always want to just be there dwelling in the moment. But as quickly as these moments come, they also go away. Just like Peter, who wanted to hold on to this moment there at the Transfiguration, but couldn't because the moment passed as he was trying to grasp it, so it is for us in our own moments of intimacy with God. But these moments have a purpose. And I think this is the message of the Transfiguration. The timing of the Transfiguration is the key to understanding it. Because you see, this happens just as Jesus and his disciples are on their way to Jerusalem. Jesus is in the final weeks of his life. He has set his eyes towards Jerusalem, towards his arrest, his trial, and his crucifixion. And he's trying to prepare his disciples for what is about to come, and they aren't getting it. Just prior to this passage from Luke, just in the preceding verses, Jesus is telling them that he is going to Jerusalem to die, and they're just not interested. They're fighting about other things. In fact, James and John send their mom to Jesus to ask Jesus if he would give James and John a place of honor in his kingdom. This is what they're bickering over. They're just not getting it. And Jesus knows what's coming. And so, as much as Jesus is trying to prepare them, the disciples aren't getting it. And so we have this moment on the mountain. This moment, this profound moment, where God says to the disciples, listen to him. It is as if God is trying to get the disciples' attention, to try to focus them in. And I also believe that this moment of the Transfiguration, this one fleeting moment on the mountaintop, probably served as a source of encouragement for the disciples, so that even when they arrived in Jerusalem and found themselves overwhelmed by everything that was happening, they at least had the memory of this moment to sustain them through the tragedy of Good Friday and Holy Saturday. That is so often, I think, what happens when we have these moments, even when they're fleeting, these moments of intimacy with God, these moments of peace and of grace, these moments of love and profound connection. These are gifts from God, as fleeting as they may be, to both get our attention and to reassure us that God is always present with us, no matter what the future may hold. We can't create these moments. We can't manufacture them. And when they do happen, we can't hold on to them. We can't dwell in them forever as much as we want to. But they are there, like that fleeting cross on the floor of Christ Church La Plata. These little gifts to remind us, to get our attention, and to remind us that God is present with us, no matter what the future beholds. Thanks be to God. Amen.